Hey everyone, Hellhog here, or you may know me as Aeyix on the Shadowlands, and I wanted to make an updated version of my 3.0 Hatred Assassin Guide. But this time, as you can see, I'm also making a Republic side version for you Shadow users. If you'd like the Hatred Assassin version of this guide, you can find that, as well as Deception, Infiltration, Mercenary, and Commando guides in the description below or on my YouTube channel. This guide will focus on the PvE side of Serenity Shadow, and is broken up into 6 parts. Timestamps to the separate parts can be found in the description below if you'd like to skip ahead. The 6 parts are Serenity's purpose and usefulness in flashpoints and operations, a gearing overview, utilities overview, abilities overview, the rotation, and finally example dummy parse. Let's get started. Overall, Serenity in operations and flashpoints is a mixed bag. There are some great cooldowns and AoE available, but unfortunately it lacks the passive damage reduction necessary to make it worth taking in the hardest of content. It's one of the lowest single target parsing classes in the game, as well as one of the squishiest, if not the squishiest. It lacks any type of further passive damage reduction outside of its light armor and relies on passive self-heals from its rotation to make up for it. Serenity also has no area of effect damage reduction, which in some harder fights is make or break. It does, however, have a 15% damage reduction from periodic effects, however that does not bring the class into too much favor. To put things into perspective, I was playing my Marauder the other day, which is significantly less geared, and I'm less skilled at it than my Shadow. On average, I was parsing higher if not even with my Shadow, and survivability was much simpler. Not to mention I brought more utility to the raid as well with Predation and Bloodthirst. Shadow is perfectly viable in any hard mode flashpoint as well as hard mode operation. However, once you get to the Nightmare tier, some bosses are practically impossible with Serenity unless your group is better built around you specifically. Serenity lacks any sort of burst. Where it does succeed is sustained AoE damage. The ability to continually refresh dots on ads and even refresh dots on the boss from the ads without ever reapplying dots is fantastic, especially with the fact one of your rotational abilities in of itself is AoE. Don't let the negatives of the class deter you though. It is fantastic to play and quite powerful in the right hands. Just keep in mind that many progression raid groups may require you to play another class for Nightmare content, and even sometimes hard mode content. Before you go any further with this guide, if you haven't done so yet, I highly recommend you go through and read all the tooltips and descriptions in your Discipline and Abilities pane so that you're familiar with the class, its buffs, abilities, and cooldowns. Now let's discuss gearing. For those watching from my Shadow guides, don't be alarmed that I'm on an Assassin. Gearing for Assassins and Shadows is exactly the same, and for the ease of simplicity and be able to show what I want, I'm on my Assassin since it's better geared. If you're looking for further theory crafting and discussion on gearing, I highly recommend checking out Ban's forum thread over on the SWTOR forums over gearing in 4.0. It's a great resource of information. If you have questions, you might be able to get them answered there. There'll be a link to that page in the description below for those interested in seeing that. Now let's get started on the actual gearing discussion. First and foremost, we want to be sure we're using a double-bladed weapon, as well as a force focus, as this provides the most force power and melee damage possible for an assassin, as well as allows us to use all our abilities. The second thing is, since this is PvE, we want to make sure we hit our accuracy cap, and the reason for this is bosses have a 10% native defense resist chance. So by having 110% force and 110% melee accuracy, we won't miss at all, which will increase our DPS significantly. We do this in 2 ways. We get a companion buff, and then we hit 684 accuracy rating. You're probably wondering, what's the companion buff? Well, if you don't know what the companion buffs are, if you go to your Legacy pane, under Global Unlocks, Imperial or Republic classes, you'll notice that if you complete conversation lines with a companion, you get a buff to your stats, whether it's crit, healing received, health, or most importantly, accuracy. The nice thing is, you only have to do this once. So let's say you've completed talking to Scorpio with your agent, or you've completed talking to Scourge with your bounty hunter, then all your characters on your legacy will have a 1% accuracy increase. Even your smuggler will have it now, even though maybe you haven't but just started your smuggler and haven't finished talking with any of these. So I highly recommend getting all your companion buffs, especially the accuracy one, as that's vital to your stats. You'll be able to spec less into accuracy, put more into alacrity and crit, thus increasing your DPS further. So the way we get that second part, the 684 rating, is twofold. You can use my method, which was the most common method until they came out with proficient stims. But if you're using a versatile stim, which provides mastery and power stat, then you use 2 initiative enhancements, which is the best in slot accuracy enhancement available, as well as 5 accuracy augments. This will put you in 220 or 224 gear, above the 604 accuracy rating with minimal stat wasted. The reason I use this still is because I PvP, so switching between PvE and PvP, it's a lot easier, not to mention the fact that I was already kind of geared toward this to begin with, and I didn't want to change when they came out with proficient stims. Now, since you're new in your gearing, or maybe you're thinking about changing your gearing that you've already established, the other method is using a proficient stim instead of a mastery stim, so you trade off the mastery and power for accuracy and crit. You still need 2 initiative enhancements, but now instead of 5 augments, you use only 2 augments, and then you can put those other 3 augments into other tertiary stats of your desire. But doing any of those in 220 or 224 gear will give you your accuracy cap. You won't be able to miss against the boss, and that's greatly important. Now, for actual gearing, for the set bonus, we want the Stalker set bonus. That's the one that applies to Assassin and Shadows, and that's what will buff all our different abilities for auto crits or doing more damage or decrease cooldowns. So make sure you get that one. Now, I told you you want 2 accuracy enhancements, the initiative enhancements, regardless of which method you choose, and you get that through 3 slots. You can get it through your hands, your boots, and your offhand. Now, as an assassin, there is an alternative to the offhand. We can use the Sorc healer offhand called Force Healer, and I highly recommend you do that. This way you don't have 3 accuracy enhancements when getting your gear, you only have 2, and so you're not having to do more min-maxing of your gear. It makes it much easier. So make sure you get the Force Healer offhand while you get the Stalker for everything else. You'll get 1 alacrity piece throughout your gear, and that comes in the headpiece. I have one in my chest piece, which required me to do a little min-maxing. I don't recommend that. If you want to get more alacrity through enhancement slots, then the easiest way is to make sure you get an alacrity earpiece or implants. Now, the way I gear, once I hit my accuracy cap for Assassins and Shadows, whether you're playing Deception Infiltration or Hatred Serenity, so I like to get about 900 alacrity, 1200 critical rating. I personally am doing that through the 2 alacrity enhancements that I mentioned. The 2 accuracy enhancements, then everything else is crit. Then for augmenting, I have the 5 accuracy augments, I have 1 critical augment, and then everything else is alacrity. So you can do what you prefer. I found that this works best for me regardless of the discipline I play. I did some testing with power augments, with mastery augments, with less alacrity and more crit, and I found that in the end this is what worked best for me. What works best for you might be different, so I recommend you test out what you like, but for a baseline, definitely hit your accuracy cap, and then highly recommend around 900 alacrity, 1200 crit, and then kind of adjust it from there. Don't augment for mastery. The amount of crit that you get from mastery at this point is hitting hard diminishing returns. If you're gonna augment that type of stat, go for power instead. However, like I said, I don't recommend it. It doesn't work for me. Might work for you. But that's gearing in a nutshell for both Deception Infiltration and Hatred Serenity Assassins and Shadows. Choosing your utilities for Serenity Shadow is easy for the most part. They will change on a fight-by-fight basis, but not too much. I like to start off by taking Celerity for the 5-second reduced cooldown on force speed. Pinning Resolve is PvP, so we don't worry about it too much. Mental Defense is very situational. If there's a fight where you're going to take a large amount of damage while you're stunned, it's nice to have for the increased survivability and reduced stress on your healers. Misdirection is something I like to take for most fights, unless I need it somewhere else. The 15% overall speed boost is just nice since we're a melee class and we don't want to be kited too much. If we're doing any sort of AoE and dot spreading, Lambast is nice to have to increase the damage of your whirling blow. It's essentially a DPS increase, so very worth taking. Shadowy Veil is a must-have since Serenity is a very squishy discipline. The 30% armor rating increase is a 4.5% damage reduction increase to kinetic and energy attacks with 224 gear. Force Wake is very situational. Unless we need to root something, it's mostly PvP and we don't worry about it. Snarling Strikes is also PvP, so we don't worry about it. Mind Over Matter is nice to have. It increases the duration of our force speed and resilience, which makes those cooldowns even more effective. Subduing Techniques is PvP, so we don't worry about it. Fade is situational. If we're going to need Force Cloak out as a cooldown more often combined with Cloak of Resilience, then it might be worth taking. Otherwise, you don't really need it in most circumstances. Nerve-wracking's PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Egress is mostly PvP, however it is situational uses in PvE. Some people like it for fights like Underlurker, however I find that when it's still going to reapply the slow, force speed itself is fast enough to get you to where you need to be. Sapped Mine is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Force Harmonics is nice to have. It gives you an extra force potency charge, which in return is a DPS increase. Kinetic Accelerations, situationally used. You can use it if you want for the speed boost, and it is an overall higher speed boost than Misdirection. And in this case, since we're using 4 in the skillful tier, we can go ahead and undo Misdirection and put in Kinetic Acceleration. However, I typically prefer just going with Misdirection for the most part. In the heroic tier, Humbling Strike is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Shadow Shelter is situational. It has its uses, mostly for a large amount of incoming attacks in a short period of time, where Sonic Wall and Sonic Rebounder aren't as useful since they're for single attacks. However, Shadow Shelter's damage reduction isn't a lot, and the healing it does is only 2k over the 6 seconds at level 65, so for the most part we only take it if we have nothing else to put utilities in. Containment is PvP for the most part, so we don't worry about it. It might be nice to have on some fights, but our sleep is only 8 seconds long versus other classes have 60 seconds, making theirs more effective. Sturdiness is PvP for the most part, although it does have its situational use in PvE. We don't really see it as super useful too much, so unless you want it for a certain fight, it's not really worth taking. Martial Prowess is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Cloak of Resilience is nice to have. It turns your Force Cloak into an extra cooldown, so it's worth having just for the survivability increase. Motion Control is mostly PvP. It doesn't really have its uses in PvE. There are already enough gap closers that you have in Serenity that you don't need it as an extra gap closer or something for movement. One with the Shadows is also mostly PvP. It might have its uses in PvE, but they're very situational, and we have enough purges already to remove impairing effects and enough speed boosts that it's not really necessary. So for the most part, this is what I take for a fight when doing AoE in Serenity. If there is no AoE, then I'll move Lambast somewhere else, such as Mental Defense, Fade, or Shadow Shelter. If there is AoE, but I need one of those other utilities, then I'll pull Misdirection out and put it into Mental Defense, Fade, or Shadow Shelter. But for most fights, this is what I generally go with. Next thing to go over is the offensive and defensive cooldowns available to us in Serenity Shadow. Our purest offensive cooldown is Force Potency, that when popped, gives us 3 charges of Force Potency, assuming we're taking the Force Harmonics utility. Force Potency for our rotational abilities will be triggered on Force Imbalance, as well as Vanquish. It will not trigger for our other dots, and ideally we want to use it on Force Imbalance more than Vanquish. It doesn't work for the dot effect of Vanquish on the initial kinetic attack. A combined offensive-defensive cooldown that we have available to us is Battle Readiness, that when popped, instantly heals us for 15% of our health, and it increases the chance that our techniques hit, as well as increases the damage that they do. When they do hit, it heals us for a small portion of our health. Now for the defensive cooldowns that we have available, if we use Mass Mind Control, which is our area taunt, in Serenity however, it is a threat drop, but when popped, it triggers Mind and Body, which increases our damage reduction by 30% for 6 seconds. Next we have Resilience, which is a purge. When popped, gives us 3 seconds, 5 seconds with the utility selection of Force and Tech Resistance by 200%. We can also trigger another purge, as well as more time of Resilience, by using Force Cloak, assuming we're using the Cloak of Resilience utility. We can also use it as a stealth res, however make sure that your dots are no longer ticking on anybody in the phase, otherwise it will put you back into combat immediately. So as you see, it triggers Resilience right away, and if I was in combat, it would have put me out of combat. Lastly, we have Deflection, that when used gives us 12 seconds of increased melee range defense chance by 60%, or pardon me, 50%. Lastly, we have 3 gap closers available to us. We have Force Speed, which has a 30-second cooldown, 25 with the Celerity utility. It increases our movement speed by 150% for the duration. We have Phase Walk, which is off global cooldown, so we can be in the middle of doing our rotation, and we can still plant it at the same time. And that lets us immediately move back to that location anywhere within 60 meters. Whoops, I went a little too far, but if you go too far, it'll click it off without putting it on cooldown. So I'll just go ahead and show that. There we go. And then lastly, we have Shadow Stride, which increases our movement speed by 75% for 3 seconds and will also automatically move us to the target. While playing Serenity, it'll also proc the Spinning Strike so that we can use that immediately, as noted. So that's all the cooldowns available to us for Serenity Shadow. Before we finally get into an example parse for Serenity, I want to briefly go over the rotation. You can pause the video here to read this if you'd like. I will also include a link in the description so you can download this. The Serenity rotation mostly follows a priority system, however there is a maximum efficiency rotation that can be done to try and maximize DPS. The max efficiency rotation is very difficult to maintain on most bosses aside from Nephra. To start, we want to make sure we're in the stance force technique. For our opener, we will try to precast Vanquish whenever possible. Do note, since it requires a 10-meter distance from the boss, you'll have to start from stealth, and you may not always be able to do this. As alternatives, you can throw in Sever Force beforehand, or you can just skip to the next item in line. So, the next item in line, we start by Shadow Striding, so we're in melee range of the boss, and we begin our Crush Spirit proc, which will proc Spinning Strike immediately, preventing bad RNG where it doesn't proc. We'll burn Force Potency for DPS, and then if we don't need it defensively within the next 2 minutes, we'll use Battle Readiness. Followed by that, Serenity Strike will proc our 2-piece set bonus, Double Strike will proc our 6-piece set bonus, and this Spinning Strike will hopefully be an auto crit that's within the Double Relic proc period. Some people like to move Serenity Strike later in the opener to move up Spinning Strike 1 GCD, and this allows a better chance of being able to get Spinning Strike within a Double Relic proc period. The downside of this is you do not have the 2-piece set bonus boost from Serenity Strike. If you have enough Alacrity and APM, however, this opener shouldn't be an issue for that. Otherwise, Serenity Strike moves into where Spinning Strike is, and these 4 abilities will move up 1 GCD. When that happens, Serenity Strike in this part of the rotation becomes the Double Strike, and Serenity Strike will then be used in the 2nd GCD at the start of the efficiency rotation. It won't be used in the 6th, and it will be used in the 10th. Basically, it alternates the pattern that you see currently. So before I get started on actually going over the rotation after the opener, let's talk about our goal for the rotation. We want to try and use Force and Balance and Serenity Strike on cooldown as much as possible. When Vanquish procs, we don't ever want to delay it more than 2 GCDs, otherwise we risk pushing further procs, or we risk clipping Vanquish. Spinning Strike can be delayed and should be delayed for higher priority attacks. However, do not delay it when you're in a sub 30% health phase of a boss. Try to maintain 100% uptime on your dots Sever Force and Force Breach, but also try and keep a 3 GCD spread between them to allow for better rotation efficiency. And finally, as an advanced tip for the rotation, whenever there's a Double Relic proc, try not to Saber Strike and instead use Spinning Strike and Double Strike, as this leads to more damage. Ideally, if you have enough force going into a Relic proc, this shouldn't be an issue. However, Saber Strike is important to our force management, especially for situations where we have high amount of force use abilities in a row, and we may not be able to Saber Strike to save ourselves. And if we end up delaying something because we don't have enough force, it throws off our efficiency rotation. So for our priority rotation, it's pretty simple. You just follow the list that you see here. You Force and Balance on cooldown, you Vanquish when it procs, you maintain uptime on Force Breach and Sever Force dots, Serenity Strike on cooldown, and then you follow your fillers based on a melee priority, where Spinning Strike's highest priority and Saber Strike's lowest priority to try and regen force. In the execution phase, the only difference is Spinning Strike moves from the 6th spot all the way up to the 1st spot, because now it's available to use on both cooldown and proc, and delaying it at all risks not being able to use it on cooldown as much, or having a proc that clips a cooldown, preventing us from being able to use it as much as we'd like. So for the efficiency rotation, this flows perfectly out of the opener, regardless of if you put Serenity Strike in the 3rd spot, or if you move it to where Spinning Strike is. As you'll note, since we're going to base our efficiency rotation based on our dots, which are 18 seconds and 12 GCDs long. By doing that, Sever Force remains in the same spot, and so does Force Breach the entire time. Since Force Imbalance is a 15-second cooldown, it finds its way moving back 2 GCDs, or 3 seconds every time in the rotation. Based on where we put Serenity Strike, it will never collide with Force Imbalance at all, so we can use Force Imbalance and Serenity Strike always on cooldown, and it also never collides with any of our dots. Lastly, Vanquish is always in the 1st or 7th spot, and eventually Force Imbalance will find its way into that spot, but we can delay Vanquish upwards of 2 GCDs, so that never becomes a problem. After that, all we have to do is follow our melee priority everywhere you see an M, and the main thing we got to do with that is to make sure we have enough force when we go into heavier hitting spots of the rotation, such as Serenity Strike, Force Imbalance, and Sever Force right after another. We have to make sure we have enough force to do that. So for situational attacks, since we are a melee class, we can't always be in melee range. So if we're stuck outside of melee range, which is outside of 4 meters, if we don't have to move, our best decision is to use Telekinetic Throw when everything else is on cooldown. If we do have to move and everything else is on cooldown, however, then we can use Project, Force Slow, or Force Stun. If we're stuck outside of 10 meters, the only things we can pretty much do is we can try and clip the boss with Force Imbalance if we're within 15 meters. We can spam Sever Force since it deals damage on application. And in extreme periods where we're going to be out of range for a long amount of time, we can use Force Potency with Telekinetic Throw. Now AoE in Serenity is very good, it's very powerful. And the AoE rotation is to basically use Force Imbalance on as many targets as possible by manually placing it. We want to make sure at least one target within our AoE has Force Breach and Sever Force. It does not have to be on the same ad, but as long as one of each of those dots are available, this isn't a problem. Then we use Whirling Blow as much as possible to spread the dots to all the targets. If there's more than 3 targets, then we'll use it as our filler. If there's less than 3 targets, then we'll just go into our single target rotation on whoever we're focusing. And then we just keep Whirling Blow to respread our dots around. And that's pretty much the Serenity rotation in a nutshell. And now finally the part you've been waiting for, unless you skipped ahead, and that's the example Serenity parse. Now before I get started, real quick I'm going to show, right here in the bottom left I have my keyboard to show my keystrokes, and in the top right I have both Star Parse to show the parse stats, as well as SWTOR to show which abilities I'm using. If you would like, in the description below there'll also be a link to the parse so you can look at it in further detail. Real quick, I'm just going to flash my character sheet so you can see what my stat distribution is. Remember I showed my assassin earlier in the video for gearing, not my shadow. And before we do any parsing, we want to make sure we apply an armor reduction module to the dummy, as well as a health modulator. Currently what's recommended is about 1.5 million. However, I'm only going to use 1 million just for time purposes. So let's get started. So this is the end of the opener here. I magically did not use a recklessness charge somewhere, which is interesting. This is the only time we let a dot run for more than 1 GCD without being reapplied. I'm going to try and hold off on the spinning strike for relic procs. There we go. So as we approach the execute phase of the boss, we want to make sure we try and use Spinning Strike as soon as possible when it procs. This way it comes off cooldown sooner than later. We want to make sure, even though it's hard to do, that we do double strike every once in a while in the execute phase so we can get our 6-piece set bonus to proc. And we're past the point of reapplying dots, so I will not reapply any more dots. There you have it. That's an example Serenity Shadow Parse. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this guide to be helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them in the comments section below and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. Feel free to share the video, and as always, may the Force be with you.